welcome to a special edition of Flanking Thoughts. Here we actually have the author Bob O'Neill that we're going to sit and talk about or talk with and go through actually the lessons of a decade, the book that we've been going through for the past few months, and get a historian or an author's perspective versus just a living historian's. And so we're actually I'll introduce Bob here in a second, but gonna actually have a pretty fun conversation, and it'll be multiple episodes, hopefully around 30-ish minutes a piece, and kind of go from there. But Bob, appreciate you coming. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
And thank you both for having me. It's a pleasure to be back out here in the Wild West.
Right, because you actually lived out here for a while, didn't you?
I did. I lived up in Montana for 10 years full time. Had a place up there for 20 years, and still miss it.
Yeah, right? Well, because the West is God's country.
It is.
So let me read your bio real quick, and we'll kind of introduce you and let our audience know kind of where your background is and your area of expertise, and go from there. So it says that you grew up in Detroit, Michigan, before moving to Northern Virginia in 1977. You were a patrol officer and a detective for the Fairfax County Police Department for 26 years. So you're has obviously a heavy law enforcement background. Probably helps you out on the investigation side of things, right?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Retiring in 2002, and you currently provide training for law enforcement agencies through Mosier Training, which is based in Colorado Springs, which is nice to see you have some ties to the Rockies still. Yep. You're a graduate of the American University and has published 2 books. One is the Small but Important Riots, the Cavalry Battles of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, and you published that in 1993. That was your first book, right?
Yes.
And your second book is this one right here, Chasing Jeb Stuart and John Mosby, which I'm actually reading right now. I tried to get your other book, but apparently it's worth $800. As we discussed before, or like I saw one for $200. But and you told me not to buy your first book because why?
Because I'm currently rewriting the book entirely. So
not even just a little edit, just an entire...
a couple new changes or new maps. I'm rewriting it front to back. It'll be an entirely different book. Same topics, but new interpretations. Essentially, almost 30 years of new research is going into it.
Wow. Well, that's great. It also says that you published several articles in magazines, including Blue and Gray, Gettysburg Magazine, and of course Little Bighorn Associates. So obviously your expertise kind of goes a little bit outside the Civil War era, a little bit. Of course, living in Montana, obviously you got to do Little Bighorn, right? Yep. Most recent article for the Blue and Gray was revolving around General George Crook's early '76 campaigns against the Sioux and Cheyenne. In the Powder River expedition on Rosebud Creek, correct?
Yes.
All right. And of course, you've guided numerous tours on battlefields, but your major focus is actually back east, correct?
Yes.
So kind of as far as getting to know you a little bit, what got you into history, and more specifically for those of us who are really interested on the mounted branch, the cavalry side of things, what got you into that niche, if you would?
So I think as we're going to talk later on, kind of the romance of the cavalry. And we'll get into, the realism versus the romance of the cavalry. But an early family vacation to Gettysburg. I was in the 5th or 6th grade, maybe. The only thing I really recall from that trip was the John Buford statue. He was a cavalry officer for the Union Cavalry. And that kind of stuck with me, and there was something about the colors, and this sounds kind of odd, I think, but the colors that the cavalry wore. My dad was a Navy officer, and so the blue and the gold kind of was part of that. He was a graduate of Notre Dame, played football for Notre Dame. The blue and the gold there, so that kind of drew me to it. And one of the very first books, and I didn't mention this when we were talking about this earlier, but that I had as a kid was, it's embarrassing to say it now, but I was that age, I didn't know that any different, was Quentin Reynolds' landmark book on the Little Bighorn.
Oh, yeah.
So it was my first introduction to George Custer. And again, if you're going to get into the romance of the cavalry and that kind of thing, Custer was a pretty good start for a young kid of my age at the time. So all of that kind of brought me to it. And then as you get older and you mature and you start looking beyond the romance, you start trying to figure out the realism. So sitting down with you is a chance to balance what I learn from my point of view with what you know as a reenactor and your research and your own
Yeah,
background to it. So we have a way to kind of balance some things out.
exactly. That's actually good to kind of point out is definitely living historian on my side, a reenactor on my side, with not a lot of academic research on my end.
Don't sell yourself short.
but on your end, not so much a reenactor at all, but very much on the historical academic side. I mean, as an author, publishing 2 books, working on a third here. So I'm looking forward to some of our banter back and forth regarding our topic that we'll discuss.
Yeah.
So what from your expertise, you're actually more focused on the Eastern theater of the war, right?
Yes.
And again, not only Eastern theater, but more drilled down on basically beginning the war till late 63. Now, what interests you, or why are you focused on that specific time frame?
I realized that it's too broad a topic to have, for me, to have the amount of knowledge or develop the knowledge that I want to on the entire war and the cavalry and all the Eastern theater. And having moved back east, getting back to where I can get into the National Archives more routinely, pre-COVID.
Yeah.
The amount of material that's there to work with, I couldn't get through it if I didn't.
It's amazing.
If I didn't hone down what I was interested in.
Yeah.
And I still go down a lot of rabbit holes, and I still get off on a lot of tangents. But the transition of the Union cavalry from and also ran to the Southern Cavalry early in the war to where they arguably became the predominant force by the summer, late 1863. That transition, what led to it, how they made that transition is what's important to me, and that's what I tend to focus on.
That's great. So our topic over the next few episodes that we're going to be doing, because we'll split this up over multiple episodes. Each one, like I said, will be kind of its own little short, I guess short's a relative segment. But we're going to actually be talking about Whittaker's book of Lessons of a Decade. And this is what I'm excited about, is from, like I said, an academic view versus an experiential archaeology view on my end. As far as, like, I guess, re-experiencing his lessons learned on my end, but also applying that to the research that you've done. What you originally, before we talked and we kind of touched bases, you hadn't actually read this book before, but he did have another book that he has some of these lessons learned. So
yes.
So go ahead and.
So he's bringing a third aspect into this discussion, if you will. If he was sitting here with us as a veteran, who went through this, looking back on it, as I think all of us do as we get older, looking back on what was the dominating period of our life, what kind of changed us or shaped us, and what I think get the sense of what he wanted to see the way the cavalry would continue to go. And that's, so he gets into what I would term the romance of the cavalry a little bit, and maybe in some aspects away from the realism, what was really going to happen. So I can now look at it with hindsight, and you would do the same. And then we throw in our different backgrounds, and I'm sure we'll come up with some different opinions about some of what he had to say. But it should make, I hope, for an interesting discussion.
Yeah, definitely. So reading the actual book, Lessons of a Decade, or the publication Lessons of a Decade, what's your initial take on Whittaker's what he thinks the biggest lessons learned are of the war? So just kind of your just off the cuff take of the book.
Well, I think it's about 50-50. I think he's on target about half the time, and he kind of falls back on what he wants the cavalry to continue being about half the time.
Yeah.
He's not, again, I have hindsight in looking at this. I know where the war went, where the world went, where the army went, where the cavalry went, where weapons took them, things like that. Yeah. He doesn't know where the next conflict's going to be with the cavalry. He seems to overlook the Indian conflicts that were ongoing when he wrote it in the westward expansion of the country. My sense is he thought that maybe our next opponent would be in Canada, maybe taking the expansion of the country north instead of west. and then so getting back to a more of a European opponent, the more massed cavalry that he, the events that he knew in the Civil War, as opposed to the smaller conflicts that generally dominated in the West.
Yeah, actually, that's one thing that we talked about previously. Is so this book was actually written. It says published in 1871. So it's in the, I guess, if you want to call it, the middle of the Indian Wars. Do you think he missed the boat on? Because again, as we'll talk about, a lot of what he discussed as far as lessons learned is really still on the idea of European conflict, mass armies, mass charges. Again, he mentions possibly going north, fighting up north in Canada, although you can read between the lines a little bit on there. But do you think he missed the boat on what the cavalry would have been doing for the next basically 20 years?
Well, we can say that he did, I think, to some extent now. But I think he probably had the same problem that a lot of folks did. So it's not my term, but folks smarter than me have looked at this period, 1865 to about 1880, as the dark ages of the United States Army, where we were stuck. I said we, the Army, was stuck in what we knew from the Civil War, and not looking forward to what might have happened. So, it's often said that we fight the last war, and it takes us a while to make the changes we need to make for the current war. And some would argue we still do that, maybe.
Right.
But this is what he grew up in. This is the formative years of his life, probably, not just his term in the service. But, this is a formative event of his life, and I think it made a big impact on him. And so he was looking at it from that perspective, and we know a little different now. So in that regard, I think he misses it a bit. But he also, the Civil War is a change between the war of the Napoleonic era, the invention of the introduction of new weaponry, things like that. So there's that transition going on, and a lot of folks were, I think, having the same issues that he had, trying to figure out where the future really lay.
Yeah, exactly. And so one thing, and we'll kind of close this opening segment out here in a little bit, but to kind of close with, one of the things he continually mentions in his chapters, whether it's weapons or dismounted skirmishing, tactics or maneuvering or the organization of the military, he mentions the difference of European terrain versus American terrain. And of course, Eastern America has a very unique terrain, compared to, well, obviously Western America out here, or even Europe. What do you think what was the biggest key or biggest difference that made American Civil War cavalry tactics different, and I guess how it played out versus, say, European conflicts or even out west here?
I think where he's on target, as you said, is that the eastern United States was much more heavily wooded than Europe had been. European civilization had been around much longer. The cities had, a lot of those areas had been deforested or thinned out, so that there was more open country, like you see out the window here,
right.
And that allowed for more massed cavalry actions. The things that you saw at Waterloo and other events like that, where the terrain in eastern United States didn't. It was still heavily forested. Virginia was still heavily forested. So the quality of the roads, the bridges, all the other terrain factors, the poor soil that turns to mud very quickly, very difficult to get cavalry through and things like that. So while there are a lot of reasons for what led to the early supremacy of the Southern cavalry over the North, and some of them I think are kind of cliche, but one that's not is the fact that the northern authorities, the northern powers that be in the military, recognized that there was not room for European cavalry tactics in where they saw the seat of the war was going to be. So they did not believe there was much use for cavalry, and so they focused on infantry. Whereas the South took a different aspect, a different view of it, and put in a lot more resources into their cavalry early on, gained that early supremacy, and then the North was playing catch up for a period of time and had to find a way, both did, the North and the South, to adapt to the terrain. And that helps develop a lot of the things that he's going to talk about in the Lessons of a Decade, and we're going to talk about here over the next few minutes.
Sounds good. So with that, we'll close our opening. The next thing we'll talk about in our next episode will be the weapons involved with cavalry, and we'll kind of combine his romance of the saber, and then of course the pistol and the carbine, and how he combines those three weapons and his lessons learned. But appreciate you guys watching us. Please subscribe to us. Please watch us on Facebook and YouTube. And until we see you in the field again, ride hard.